Have you ever heard about Alabama's most haunted prison? It's not like the spooky places you see in the movies or hear about in casual conversations. This prison, with its rusted gates and crumbling stone walls, has a history that goes beyond the ordinary tales of ghost sightings or unsettling noises. No, this one has a deeper darkness, something far more dangerous and insidious lurking inside. The prison, built over a century ago, was once a place of punishment, housing the state's most notorious criminals. It was said to be a place where prisoners were pushed to the edge of sanity, a place where their souls were broken long before their bodies were. Over the years, it became notorious not just for the severity of its conditions, but for the strange occurrences that seemed to haunt every corner of the building. But as time went on, the stories surrounding it grew darker. Locals in the small town nearby know the truth about Alabama's most haunted prison. They whisper about it when they think no one is listening, but they'll never say it out loud, especially to outsiders. The rumors are passed from one generation to the next, each telling, adding more to the legend. The truth, they say, is far worse than anyone could ever imagine. This prison sits deep in the woods, miles away from any signs of civilization. The trees are so thick that even on a clear day, the sun barely reaches the ground, casting everything in a dim, eerie light. The prison itself is a massive structure, tall stone walls that seem to rise up from the earth like the bones of some ancient beast. The iron gates are rusted, but they still stand, creaking in the wind. It's as if time itself has forgotten this place, and yet it hasn't. People who've dared venture near the gates say that the air is always heavy, thick with something they can't quite describe. At first glance, it might look like an eyesore, something you'd want to forget about, but for those who live nearby, it's a constant reminder of something much darker, a secret that's been buried beneath the surface for too long. The stories have always been there, simmering beneath the surface. You hear them when you talk to the old folks at the diner, or when you sit with the local bartender after hours. They talk about things they've seen, things they've heard, things that they wish they could forget. One of the most chilling stories is about the killer who once roamed the halls of the prison. But he wasn't just any killer. He was something more. They say he's not dead, not gone. He's still there, inside those walls, waiting. The prison is known for its cruel past. For decades, it was a place where Alabama's most dangerous criminals were locked away and forgotten. But there's something about this prison that made it different from others. There's a certain feeling you get when you're around it, a sense of unease that you can't shake, no matter how much you try to ignore it. It's a place where bad things happened, really bad things. And they say that bad energy has never left. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when the prison was a functioning part of the state's justice system, housing men who had committed terrible crimes. But over time, strange things began to happen. The guards who worked there at night would speak of odd noises in the empty cells, of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, of strange figures seen out of the corner of their eyes. The longer they worked, the more they started to see things they couldn't explain. A shadow moving across the floor when no one was there. A cold breath on the back of their necks. The feeling of being watched. The prisoners, of course, were used to the creepy atmosphere. After all, they were the ones locked away in those dark, lonely cells. They'd heard the stories too. Some of them said they'd heard the same noises. Some even claimed to have seen the figures. But it was more than that. There were rumors that the prison was cursed, that something dark lived within its walls, feeding off the pain and suffering of those held there. Some said it was a spirit, a ghost of a long-dead prisoner. Others said it was something much older, something that had been there long before the prison was ever built. But no matter what they believed, the one thing that everyone agreed on was that there was something in that prison, something evil, and it didn't want anyone to leave. The worst of the stories, however, is the one about the killer. His name was Henry Lawson, a man whose crimes were so gruesome that they made the local news for months. Lawson was a murderer with a twisted mind, and after his capture, he was sent to Alabama's most notorious prison to serve out his sentence. The thing about Lawson, though, was that he wasn't just any ordinary prisoner. No, there was something off about him. He was different from the others. His presence, his cold, dead eyes, they were enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. Even the most hardened guards couldn't stand to be around him for too long. One night, Henry Lawson was found dead in his cell, or at least, that's what they thought. The coroner said he died from natural causes, but there were no signs of illness or injury. No explanation for his sudden death. It was almost like he had just given up and let go of life. But that wasn't the end. After Henry's death, strange things began happening again. But this time, it was worse. The whispers grew louder, the figures more distinct. Guards who had worked in the prison for years began reporting that they could hear Henry's voice at night, calling out to them from the darkness. But when they went to check, there was nothing there. Nothing but an empty cell. And worse yet, the murders began again. Gruesome killings that could only be described as his work. The same method, the same brutality. And the worst part? No one could catch him. No one could stop him. You see, they say Henry didn't die. He never left. He's still there, haunting the prison, hunting anyone who dares enter. People say that he's not just a ghost. He's a force, a malevolent energy that can't be destroyed. And if you're unlucky enough to find yourself inside those walls, you might just be his next victim. The question is, will you be the one who escapes, or will you become just another lost soul in the prison's dark, twisted history. The locals know better than to tempt fate. They've heard the stories, seen the signs, and they've learned that some places are better left undisturbed. Because once you step foot inside Alabama's most haunted prison, you may never make it out alive. It all began in 1932, when a man named Henry Lawson was brought into the infamous prison of Alabama, a facility that was already well known for housing some of the state's most dangerous criminals. Lawson wasn't just any criminal. He was a murderer, a man with a dark reputation that sent shivers down the spines of everyone who had ever heard his name. His violent crimes, a series of brutal killings that seemed to have no rhyme or reason, had shocked the local community. It wasn't just the gruesomeness of the acts themselves, but the sheer terror he inspired. The victims were often found in horrific states, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. People started to fear that Lawson's mind was as dark as the things he did, and his presence alone seemed to send a cold chill wherever he went. Lawson had been on the run for months before being captured in a bloody standoff with police. When they finally arrested him, the terror he had caused across the region came to an abrupt halt. Or so everyone thought. But what happened next only deepened the mystery surrounding this ruthless killer. The prison, a towering fortress of stone, surrounded by thick woods, had always been an unsettling place. Its long corridors, locked gates, and constant atmosphere of dread were enough to make even the most hardened inmates uneasy. But when Lawson arrived, something changed. It wasn't just the atmosphere of the prison that seemed to shift. It was as if something darker had entered the building with him. Within days of his arrival, strange events began to unfold. At first, it started with the guards. They reported hearing footsteps echoing in the hallways long after the prison was supposed to be silent. At first, they thought it was just the usual creaking of the old building settling into its foundations. But soon, the footsteps became more frequent, and they began to seem almost purposeful, like someone or something was walking just ahead of them. Guards who walked the darkened hallways at night would hear these footsteps, always behind them, always too close for comfort. The hairs on the back of their necks would rise, and the feeling of being followed would be overwhelming. But it wasn't just the guards. The inmates, too, began to speak of strange occurrences. They would hear whispers in the middle of the night, soft voices that seemed to be calling their names. At first, they assumed it was just the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. But the voices started to sound too clear, too real. The prisoners would wake up in the dead of night, lying in their cells, listening to the faint murmurs just outside their bars. No one could make out the words. For some, it felt like someone was standing just outside their cell, watching them. For others, it was like the whispers were coming from the very walls themselves. It wasn't long before the rumors began to spread. Some said the prison was haunted by the souls of the men who had died there, but others, including the guards, believed something far darker was at play. Something more evil. It wasn't just ghosts they were hearing. It was something alive, and it was getting closer every day. And then, in the dead of night, Henry Lawson disappeared. It was a night like any other. The guards did their rounds. The prisoners did their best to sleep, and the whispers, those strange, unsettling whispers, continued to haunt the prison. But when the morning bell rang, and the guards went to check on Lawson in his cell, they found it empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. His bed was untouched, as though he had never even been there. It was as if Henry Lawson had simply vanished into thin air. The guards searched the prison top to bottom, scouring every hallway, every cell, every hidden corner. Guards who had once brushed off the rumors began to talk openly about feeling watched, about hearing noises in places they knew should be empty. It was as if the prison itself had come alive with an energy that no one could explain. But still, the mystery of Lawson's disappearance remained unsolved. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but there was no sign of Lawson. No body was found. No clues. The officials, desperate for answers, started to come up with theories. Perhaps he had escaped somehow. Maybe he had bribed someone on the inside, or had help from an outside accomplice. But the more they searched, the more they realized that none of these theories made sense. There was no evidence that he had escaped, and more disturbingly, there was no sign of him anywhere. But while the prison authorities scrambled to make sense of the situation, something far more sinister was beginning to unfold. The murders began again. The killings started small at first, the kind of crime that could be overlooked by the busy prison staff. But as time went on, the murders grew more gruesome, more brutal. The bodies were left in the same horrifying state as before, mutilated, drained of life, and abandoned in dark corners of the prison. The more the killings continued, the more the pattern became apparent. It was as though the same killer was back, and no one could explain how. As the weeks passed, the officials began to piece together a chilling theory. Henry Lawson had never left the prison at all. They believed that his disappearance wasn't an escape. It was something far worse. They believed he had somehow become the prison. And just as the rumors had suggested, Lawson had turned into something more than human. He was a force, a shadow that moved through the dark corners of the prison, hunting down anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. The legend of Henry Lawson took root in the minds of the prison's staff and inmates. They began to whisper his name in fear, knowing that his presence still haunted the prison. But what they didn't know was just how far Lawson's reach had extended. He was no longer just a man. He was a killer, one who couldn't be stopped. And as the murders continued, the whispers only grew louder. Some said they heard his voice, low and menacing, calling them in the dark. Others claimed to see his silhouette, a shadow that moved with a terrifying purpose. But no one could stop him. Months had passed since Henry Lawson's mysterious disappearance, but the prison still carried the weight of his presence, like a dark shadow that lingered over everything. What had once been rumors, whispers in the corners of the prison, stories shared behind closed doors, soon turned into something undeniable. The prison, that grim structure surrounded by dense woods and isolation, had become more than just a place of punishment. It had become a place of terror, where death hung thick in the air, and where something dark, something malevolent, seemed to feed off the fear of those trapped within its walls. It began subtly at first. Guards on their night shifts would report strange occurrences, footsteps echoing through the empty halls, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the distinct sensation of being watched. These were the same guards who had dismissed the stories of the earlier days, who had brushed off the growing rumors of Henry's ghost. But as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. The sounds grew louder, the whispers more distinct. It felt as though the very walls of the prison were alive, pulsating with an energy that made the air feel thick and suffocating. But the worst part wasn't the sounds, the feeling of being watched, or the sensation that something was just waiting in the shadows. It was the deaths. One by one, the guards began to die. It started with a man named George, a veteran of the prison who had seen his share of dark days. He was a tough man, a man who had worked in prisons all over the state, but nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered in Alabama's haunted prison. On his usual rounds, George entered the solitary confinement block, the most isolated part of the prison. And that was the last time anyone saw him alive. When his fellow guards went to check on him the next morning, they found his body slumped against the wall of his cell. But there was something wrong. There were no wounds, no marks of any struggle, no sign of injury. His body was as cold as ice, his face expressionless, his eyes wide open, staring into the emptiness. It was as if the life had been drained from him, leaving nothing but a lifeless shell. The coroner's report offered no answers. There was no cause of death, nothing in his blood, nothing in his system could explain why a man so strong and healthy could die without a trace. The only thing the report could confirm was that George had died without any external force acting upon him. He had simply died, and when they opened his cell, they found something else, a lingering presence, something that couldn't be explained. The air in the room was cold, unnaturally cold, and the walls seemed to hum with a strange energy. It was as if George's death wasn't just the end of a life. It was part of something much larger. The next death came a week later. This time it was a younger guard named Robert, who had just begun working at the prison. He was nervous about the stories, but he had shrugged them off, convinced that they were just that, stories. But as the nights wore on, Robert began to feel the same dread that had plagued the other guards. He heard the footsteps, felt the whispers, and began to notice the eerie sensation of being watched from the shadows. It wasn't long before Robert began to see things. Flickers of movement out of the corner of his eye, shapes darting just beyond his line of sight. And then, one night, during his rounds in the west wing of the prison, Robert disappeared. His body was found the next morning, sprawled out in the hallway just outside the cell block. His eyes were wide open, just like George's, but this time there was something even more disturbing. Robert's skin was pale, almost as if he had been drained of all color. His hands were clenched into fists, and his body was positioned in a way that made it appear as though he had been fighting something. But again, there were no signs of struggle. No marks, no bruises, nothing to suggest that he had fought against an assailant. It was as if he had simply fought against an invisible force, one that had overpowered him with ease. It was as if his very life had been sucked out of him. As the months passed, more guards met the same fate. One by one, they fell, their deaths as mysterious as the first. Some were found in their cells, others in the dark hallways. But each death was eerily similar. No wounds, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as though the prison was taking them, one by one, draining the very life from them until they were nothing more than cold, lifeless husks. Rumors began to spread among the remaining guards. The older ones, the ones who had been there longer, were the first to start speaking in hushed tones about the curse, about the thing that haunted the prison. They spoke of Henry Lawson, not as a man, but as something far worse, a spirit, a killer who had somehow transcended death, who had found a way to keep his presence alive in the prison, feeding off the terror and fear of those trapped within its walls. They said that Lawson was no longer just a murderer. He was a force of nature, a malevolent spirit who would never rest until the prison was emptied of all life. The younger guards were skeptical at first, but as the bodies continued to pile up, they couldn't deny it. Something was happening. Something beyond their understanding. The air grew heavier with each passing day. The whispers grew louder. And the footsteps, always the footsteps, seemed to follow them wherever they went. Even the most hardened officers began to feel the weight of the prison. The weight of something dark that pressed in on them, suffocating them, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Some tried to fight back. They armed themselves with whatever they could find. Bats, knives, anything that could offer a sense of protection. But no matter what they did, they could never escape the feeling that something was hunting them. Something that could never be fought off, no matter how hard they tried. The presence was too strong. It wasn't just in the shadows. It was everywhere. In the walls. In the air. In the very ground beneath their feet. It was as though the prison itself had become a living thing. A thing that wanted them all dead. And worse, the guards started to realize that Henry had returned. It was impossible to ignore. They felt his presence, his weight in the air. They heard his whispers. They saw the flickers of movement in the corners of their eyes. And they knew that he was the cause of it all. He was the reason their colleagues were dying. He was the reason the prison felt so alive with terror. But what terrified them most was the realization that no one was going to leave. The prison was now a tomb, and everyone inside, everyone, was doomed. Henry wasn't just a ghost. He wasn't just a spirit. He was something far worse. He was a force. And that force had only just begun to feed. The question wasn't whether they could escape. It was whether anyone would make it out alive. And with each passing day, the answer seemed less and less likely. The most terrifying part of the prison's curse came from those who somehow managed to survive its grip. It wasn't just the deaths of the guards or the eerie whispers that filled the halls. No, it was the experiences of those who had lived through it, the ones who had seen something so unimaginable, so profoundly disturbing, that it haunted them for the rest of their lives. One such person was John Willis, a guard who had been stationed at Alabama's haunted prison for several years. John had heard the stories, of course, and like many of his fellow guards, he had dismissed them as superstition. He wasn't easily scared. He had seen violence, madness, and death in the prisons he'd worked at before. But this place, this prison, was different. It had a weight to it that he couldn't explain, a sense of wrongness that hung thick in the air. But it wasn't until one fateful night that John would come face to face with something that would change his life forever. It started as just another night shift. The prison was dark, silent, save for the usual sounds of distant doors creaking and the occasional shuffle of the night watchman's boots echoing through the halls. John was walking down one of the long, narrow corridors, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The faint light of his torch reflected off the damp walls, casting long, eerie shadows that danced in the corners. It was the kind of place where every sound felt amplified, where the silence seemed to suffocate you, pressing down on your chest until it became hard to breathe. John had grown used to it, but that night there was something different. As he walked, his flashlight caught something in the distance. 2 red, glowing dots peeking out from behind a corner. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light. Perhaps it was the reflection from a piece of metal. Or maybe his eyes were just tired. But as he took another step, the red eyes didn't go away. In fact, they seemed to move, following him as he advanced down the hall. No sound, no movement, just the eyes, glowing in the dark, unblinking and relentless. John paused, his heart suddenly racing. He stood still, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a trick? Was it just his imagination? But as he stood there, the eyes didn't disappear. They were too real, too unsettling. He tried to shake it off, thinking perhaps it was just a reflection, or the light from his own flashlight catching the wrong angle. But his instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the hallway, to go anywhere but closer to those eyes. But as if on their own accord, his legs moved forward, slowly at first, almost against his will. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the eyes, even as his heart hammered in his chest. With each step he took, the eyes seemed to move closer, following him, never blinking. His breath caught in his throat as the fear began to settle in his gut, a cold, gnawing feeling that he couldn't shake. He felt like prey being stalked by something much larger, much darker than he could understand. And then, just as he was within a few feet of the corner, something strange happened. The eyes blinked. It wasn't a normal blink, either. It was more like a slow, deliberate motion, as if the creature behind them was aware of him, watching him, waiting for him to come closer. In that moment, something inside John snapped. He didn't know why, but every fiber of his being screamed for him to run. He turned on his heel and bolted down the hallway, his flashlight bouncing erratically in front of him. His boots pounded against the cold stone floor as his breath came in ragged gasps. It was then that he felt it, the unmistakable sensation that someone or something was right behind him. He could hear it, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps echoing in the darkness, matching his pace just behind him. But when he glanced over his shoulder, there was nothing. The hallway was empty, bathed in shadows, as silent as death itself. And yet, he could feel it, a presence so close that he could almost feel its breath on the back of his neck. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and he ran faster, desperate to escape whatever was following him. His legs burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, as though whatever it was behind him was gaining speed. John pushed himself harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring everything except the need to get out of that cursed place. He reached the end of the hallway, bursting through the heavy metal door that led to the main exit. He didn't even stop to look back. He didn't care if anyone saw him, didn't care if he was supposed to finish his shift. All that mattered was getting out, getting as far away from the prison as possible. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, his legs almost giving way beneath him, but he kept running. He ran all the way to the parking lot, to his car, and without thinking, he slammed the door shut behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. But even as he drove away, The image of those glowing red eyes lingered in his mind. When John arrived home, he could barely speak. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tried to explain what had happened. But no one believed him. His coworkers dismissed it as a trick of the light, a moment of fear-induced imagination. But John knew better. He knew what he had seen, and he knew that it wasn't over. He never went back to the prison. Not once. He couldn't. The fear had taken root in his soul, a fear so deep and all-consuming that it left him paralyzed. He didn't care what his colleagues said. He knew what he had seen, and he knew that Henry Lawson wasn't just a man who had vanished into thin air. He was still out there, and those red eyes, that terrible, unblinking stare, were proof of that. John's coworkers said he wasn't the same after that night. They said he had become a shadow of the man he once was, haunted by what he had seen. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but he didn't need to. Those red eyes were burned into his memory, a terrifying reminder that whatever haunted that prison was far more than just a ghost. It was a force, a presence that would never let go. And as for the prison, it continued to stand, dark and silent, waiting for its next victim. The legend of the red eyes spread like wildfire among the remaining guards, and though many tried to laugh it off, deep down they knew the truth. Henry Lawson, or whatever had become of him, was still there, watching, waiting, and hunting anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. The prison had been abandoned for years, its once imposing structure now nothing more than a crumbling relic of a darker past. The gates were rusted, the walls covered in vines and decay, but the stories remained. The locals in the nearby towns still spoke of it, though most were too afraid to venture near it. Even now, the children would dare each other to approach the old prison, but none ever got close enough to see the faded graffiti on its walls or hear the wind howling through its shattered windows. The town had long since moved on, but some of the older folks still clung to the old stories, and they knew something that most people didn't, something terrifying. Eli was one of those people. He wasn't just an old-timer who sat around the bar and reminisced about the past. He was a man who had lived through the horrors of the prison. A man who had been there, behind the walls, during the darkest days of its history. Eli had spent years in that prison, locked away for a crime he had committed in his youth. He had witnessed the brutality, the suffering, and the eerie happenings that seemed to plague the place. But what haunted him most was what he knew about Henry Lawson, the prisoner who had become more than just a man. According to Eli, Henry didn't just kill people. Henry fed off them. His power grew with each soul he took, each life he snuffed out in the most horrific ways imaginable. Eli wasn't one to exaggerate or tell tall tales, and even now, years after the prison had been abandoned, his eyes would grow wide, and his voice would drop to a hushed whisper when he spoke of the things he had witnessed. To him, it wasn't just a man who killed for pleasure. It was something far darker, something far older. Henry had become a force of nature, a malevolent spirit tied to the prison itself. Eli would tell anyone who cared to listen that the prison was cursed, that it had been cursed from the very beginning. The stones that made up its walls weren't just rocks. They were something more. They were alive in a way that no one could truly understand. The walls of the prison had soaked in the suffering of countless men over the years. The cries of the tortured, the whispers of the dying, the echoes of the broken. It was that suffering, Eli claimed, that had given rise to something far worse than any human could imagine. The prison had become a vessel for Henry's spirit, a dark sanctuary where he could live on, feeding off the fear and pain of those trapped within it. When Eli spoke of Henry Lawson, it wasn't just the ghost of a man he was describing. It was something far more terrifying. Henry wasn't merely haunting the prison. He was the prison. His spirit had become so intertwined with the very foundation of the place that it could never truly be destroyed. The more pain and suffering Henry caused, the stronger he became. It was as if he had been born from the prison itself, forged in the fires of violence and rage. And it was that power, that insidious connection to the very land the prison stood on, that kept him alive, even after his body had been long gone. Eli had seen it all during his time in the prison. The strange occurrences, the unexplainable deaths, the feeling of something watching, always watching. The guards who had tried to stand up to Henry, the ones who had thought they could fight back, were the ones who didn't last long. They were the ones who vanished in the middle of the night, their bodies found cold and lifeless, their faces frozen in terror. The longer they stayed, the more they seemed to lose themselves. As if Henry's presence was slowly devouring them, piece by piece. Eli had seen it happen to men he had known for years, men who had been strong, fearless, before they had entered the prison. After a while, it was as if the prison had drained them of their will to fight, leaving behind nothing but empty shells. Eli had been one of the lucky ones. He had survived, but not without a cost. The horrors he had experienced in that place stayed with him, haunting his dreams and clouding his every waking thought. He had never been able to shake the feeling that Henry was still out there, waiting. And every time he thought about going near the prison, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He knew better than anyone that there was no escaping it, no escaping him. One night, after a long evening of telling stories to the younger folk at the local tavern, Eli pulled aside a young man who had been asking about the prison. The young man, full of bravado and curiosity, had been eager to hear the tales of the haunted place, thinking it would be some exciting adventure. Eli looked into his eyes and saw the same fire that had once burned in his own. Youthful, naive, ready to take on whatever came his way. But Eli knew better. He had learned the hard way that some things weren't meant to be faced head-on, no matter how brave you were. Some things were better left alone. You're thinking of going there, aren't you? Eli asked, his voice rough and low. The young man, surprised by Eli's bluntness, nodded. I've heard the stories. I want to see for myself. It can't be as bad as people say, right? Eli's expression darkened. He looked around the room as if making sure no one else was listening. You don't want to go there, son. Trust me. Henry Lawson isn't just a ghost. He's not something that you can see and run from. He's tied to that prison, to those walls. And once you look for him, once you go looking for answers, you're marked. And once you're marked, there's no going back. He'll find you. You can't hide from him. Not in there, not anywhere. The young man scoffed, shaking his head. That's just superstition. I'll be fine. It's just a prison, right? Eli's hand shot out, grabbing the young man's arm with a grip stronger than he expected. No, it's not just a prison. It's a tomb. And Henry's spirit lives in the darkness between those walls. It's a force. You can't just walk in there and expect to leave without paying the price. The prison is his now, and you're just a guest in his house. If you want to make it out, you'd better pray you never see those red eyes, because once you do, it's already too late. The young man pulled his arm free, clearly uneasy, but still determined. He gave Eli a half-hearted smile and stood up, walking away. Eli watched him go, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what was coming. He had seen it too many times before, the bravado, the courage of youth, the belief that nothing could hurt them. But Eli knew the truth. He knew the prison's curse wasn't just a myth. And he knew Henry was waiting. Eli never saw the young man again. Some say he went to the prison and never returned. Others say he was found weeks later, his body cold and lifeless, with a look of pure terror frozen on his face. But Eli knew. He knew that Henry had found him, as he had found so many others. The prison had claimed another soul. Eli's warning remained. The worst thing you could do was look for Henry Lawson. Because once you did, once you became curious, you had already sealed your fate. Henry would find you. And when he did, there would be no escape. Years had passed since the old prison had been shut down, its towering walls now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. The once pristine grounds were a shadow of their former self, abandoned to the ravages of time and nature. Yet even in its dilapidated state, the prison still drew people to it, like moths to a flame. The locals, those who remembered the dark stories and whispered legends, still avoided it, crossing the street to avoid even glancing at its rusted gates. But to the younger generation, the thrill of the unknown was irresistible. They dared each other to venture inside, to test their courage, to prove that the terrifying tales were just that, stories. Some came in groups, others alone, eager to confront the unknown, convinced that they could uncover the truth behind the whispers of ghostly apparitions, killer spirits, and the infamous Henry Lawson. The reasons varied, but the outcome was almost always the same. The moment they crossed the threshold of that cursed place, something changed. The air became heavier, the darkness more oppressive. It was as though the prison itself absorbed every ounce of light and hope from those who entered, leaving only the cold, unyielding presence of something ancient and malignant. Some of them came out with tales of strange occurrences, footsteps in the dark, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, whispers that rattled the nerves, and eyes glowing red in the corners of their vision. Others, however, didn't come out at all, at least not in the same state. The first time it happened, the group of teenagers laughed it off. They had heard the stories, everyone had. The ghosts of old prisoners, the cursed spirit of Henry Lawson, the strange deaths of the guards, but none of it seemed real to them. They were more interested in the rush, the excitement of doing something that their parents and the older folks warned them against. So, they ventured into the prison on a dare, each one trying to outdo the other with bravado, with jokes about the paranormal, mocking the ancient legends that had haunted the place for decades. But something changed as soon as they stepped inside. It wasn't the building that made them uneasy at first. It was the overwhelming silence. The prison had once been alive with the sounds of shuffling feet, the clang of doors, the distant cries of the incarcerated. Now it was still, eerily still, like the very walls were holding their breath. The teenagers were forced to speak in hushed voices, their words bouncing off the stone walls and echoing back at them, making them feel smaller and more vulnerable. It started with the footsteps. At first, they thought it was just their own, echoing off the cold floors, the sound of their shoes on the cracked tiles. But as they continued down the narrow corridor, the footsteps grew louder, closer. One of the girls, Jenna, stopped and turned, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others paused, straining to listen. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. But the silence that followed was thick, suffocating. No one wanted to be the first to speak. They continued their journey deeper into the prison, moving from room to room, their flashlights flickering in the darkness. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to grow colder. There was something in the shadows, something that watched them, something that breathed just beyond the light. They could feel it, each of them in their own way. Some heard whispers, soft, unintelligible, like voices just out of reach. Others saw flashes of movement, shadows flitting in and out of the corners of their vision. But when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing except the blackness of the prison, swallowing them whole. Jenna was the first to scream. It came without warning. A sudden, high-pitched shriek that echoed through the halls. She had turned a corner and come face to face with something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The others rushed to her side, their flashlights shaking. But when they turned the corner, there was nothing. No figure, no ghost, just empty space. And yet, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Jenna's eyes were wide with terror, her breath shallow. She couldn't speak, only point, trembling, at the space where the figure had been. After that, the group's demeanor changed. The jokes stopped. The bravado was gone. They moved through the halls more cautiously, their footsteps now heavy, each one echoing louder than before. The tension was palpable, thickening the air around them. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the prison, the more the sense of dread grew. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, the weight of history, of violence and suffering, pressing down on them, suffocating them. And then, just when they thought they couldn't take it anymore, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to be their own. They turned, expecting to see another of their group, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, until they were right on top of them. Yet there was no one to be seen. One of the boys, Mark, tried to break free from the group and run, but the moment he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him. He screamed, his voice high with panic, but the others couldn't get to him. The walls seemed to bend, the corridors twisting into an impossible maze, trapping them inside. What happened next is something no one really understands. When the group finally managed to escape, Mark was nowhere to be found. They called out to him, but there was no answer. The others came stumbling out of the prison, their faces ashen, their bodies trembling. They couldn't speak, couldn't explain what had happened. But one thing was certain: Mark was gone, and they were no longer the same. Some say that Mark was never really lost. Some say he's still in there, wandering the dark halls, a prisoner of the prison itself. Others claim he was taken by Henry, his soul claimed by the spirit that still haunts those walls. Whatever the truth, no one ever saw Mark again. And the others? They never spoke of it. Not in detail. Not to anyone. Their eyes always seemed distant, as if they were seeing something that no one else could see. The truth about the prison was buried with them. Those who dared to enter after them, driven by curiosity or the need to prove their own courage, found themselves caught in the same trap. Some left in a state of shock, unable to speak, paralyzed with fear. Others, like Mark, were never seen again. Those who returned spoke in fragmented sentences, their memories broken, their minds shattered by whatever it was they had encountered. The footsteps, the red eyes, the whispers, they were all real. And the prison wasn't just haunted. It was alive with a darkness that consumed everything in its path. It took those who dared to challenge it, to face the truth. It took their lives, their souls, and left nothing but empty shells behind. And Henry? He was still there, still waiting. Because the killer from Alabama's most haunted prison didn't care about your reason for visiting. He didn't care about your bravery, your curiosity, or your need to find the truth. He only cared about one thing: your soul. And once you set foot inside that cursed place, you risked losing it forever. So the question is, are you brave enough to find out? Because if you are, there's no guarantee that you'll ever make it out the same. Or perhaps, like so many others before you, you won't make it out at all.